because I have two English panelists. I think it's the only panel with only English-speaking panelists. I would like to switch to English and come to the first thematic panel, which is on hidden debt. And I would like to welcome María José Romero, who is right by my side. She is working for the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodad, in Brussels, since 2012, I think, as a policy and advocacy manager, and she's working, or her main subject is private finance and development finance institutions, and as such she has done comprehensive research and analysis, not only on these issues, but also very much on the risks of PPP. I think some of the work is also outside on the table. And then I hope I can also welcome on the monitor Mark Flanagan. See there?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
No?
Yeah? Yeah? Yes? I can hear you.
He was supposed to be on the line and join us on the monitor. I don't know, maybe later. Mark Flanagan, let me still introduce him, joined the IMF. He's working with the International Monetary Fund and joined the IMF in 1998. Has worked in countries in Africa, South Asia, and Europe. He is Hello? Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me?
He's Assistant Director of the IMF Strategy, IMF Strategy, Policy and Review Department, and there he is in charge of Debt Policy Division, and as such has worked on debt analysis and debt transparency issue. And there you see him. Hello, Mark. I'm really glad to see you.
Hello, Elizabeth. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, I cannot hear you very properly.
Is it a volume issue?
Yes, this is a little better, but if you still can turn up, I think would be still better. Okay, anyway, Mark, thank you very much, especially for getting up very early this morning. I'm glad you're with us. I don't know, you probably have not been listening the introduction part. I just briefly mentioned what we consider public-private partnership, made a short, definition. But my first question goes to you. We all know that there's a tremendous need for global investment in sustainable infrastructure to achieve the SDGs, and the magic word here, not only for the IMF, also for the World Bank and many others, like the G20, is unlocking private finance. And PPPs here seem to be the easiest solution, which covers both the shortage of public funds and the tremendous need. My question would be, do you really think that PPPs are the adequate means to achieve the SDGs without constraining necessary spending on infrastructure or other public spending? Or is there not also a high risk of governments becoming indebted as a result of PPP?
Hello, Elizabeth. Is my volume better now?
This is much better, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I'll say a few words in response to that. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about PPPs. I certainly agree with you that these are instruments that have received a lot of attention as potential ways to fill financing gaps in developing countries. Now, the IMF actually does work in this area in the sense of providing workshops to government officials on the risks of PPPs and how to assess these risks. Now, let me say a few words about this. I first want to briefly touch on potential benefits from PPPs, because there is a story to be told here, even though it might be a highly specialized one, a very rare case where these things succeed. I do want to mention potential benefits from PPPs. You know, the argument goes something like the private sector is able to offer better value for money because of its drive and motivation. There are efficiency gains linked to internalization of maintenance strategies, and higher quality makes it easier to introduce fees. Other arguments emphasize that under the right circumstances, PPPs may be effective in containing cost overruns and delays, in improving project design and quality of service, and in guaranteeing proper and timely maintenance. Now, for those who make these arguments, you end up coming to the point where you believe that PPPs might in fact create fiscal space for a government. Advocates would argue that in doing this, there's a large benefit. It frees up fiscal space. Not only does the government get infrastructure provided by the private sector, but it gets more room on its own budget to invest in public infrastructure. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the problems that PPPs create. So, if we go to the second slide after this, yes. So, it's useful to think about the two models of PPPs. There are financing PPPs and funding PPPs, and they're slightly different. In a financing PPP, it's expected that the private partner brings financing of the project. In a funding PPP, the private partner never funds the project. Instead, you have different ways of doing it. But let me first talk about financing PPPs briefly. So the private sector partner in that case has to go out and get financing, either debt, equity, or government support. And therein lies the problem, the government support. And that can come through guarantees, it can come through subsidies, it can come through equity injections. Unfortunately, it can also come through things like tax amnesties. So we often see countries that use PPPs utilize hidden assets. We often talk about the hidden debts of PPPs, but oftentimes when governments do them, they manage to transfer assets that aren't fully disclosed to the public or not correctly recorded to the private partner. However, the more common model is funding PPPs. And in a funding PPP, we think of three possibilities, where the government funds it directly by paying during the operation, or user-funded PPPs, where we have service fees, or some combination thereof. And these tend to generate problems for a number of reasons. The government, in government-funded PPPs, so you have a long-term contract for services, and it can be fixed or variable. You know, when I'll come to the international experience soon, but the problem there we tend to see is renegotiations, and the renegotiations never tend to favor the creditor or the debtor, the government. The renegotiations usually tend to favor the creditor. Now, in user-funded PPPs, one of the issues there is usually governments give guarantees about the level of demand, and so on the service fees expected. And it's, I'd say, more a norm that the level of demand is overestimated. So we see instances like in Spain, where they built many international airports, and they've had to close some because they just don't have the traffic. So you tend to get liabilities popping up because of underestimation of demand and the guarantees governments have given, and because of renegotiations. I do want to touch on the experience with these things very briefly. If we could go to the next slide. Can people see the slides? So we've looked at international experience worldwide. So first thing I want to note, and this is important, when people tell you PPPs are going to solve a problem, renegotiations are common and frequent and tend to favor private sector operators. Let's keep that in mind when people give you analysis. It says that this PPP is better than the alternative of direct public investment. We tend to see weak monitoring capacity across the public sector, a weak role of the Ministry of Finance. There's lack of integration of PPPs into the budgetary process and a lack of transparency in fiscal reporting. Now, what we also tend to see is gradually PPPs tend to get pushed outside the general government into state enterprises, parastatals, etc. So that removes it from the government balance sheet, even indirectly. Now it's twice removed. So it's somewhere hidden on the balance sheet of a state enterprise, which, if you look at the government counts, is difficult. The balance sheet of a state enterprise is difficult to discern in the first place. But having a debt hidden on the balance sheet of a state enterprise is all the more difficult to discern. And yet, at the end of the day, the government owns the state enterprise and has to make up for any problems that it experiences. I want to make the case that even when properly managed, PPPs can create trouble for governments. In the short run, they create fixed assets, but these are not liquid, while PPP liabilities are payable. So you can get into debt trouble if you're a government doing these things. And typically, limited data on the issues I mentioned tends to underestimate liabilities. And in the medium run, they might improve public net worth, but only if the fixed assets are maintained properly by the private operator, which requires continued government scrutiny. And not all governments have that ability. And that deferred maintenance is a form of hidden liability for the government if it inherits an asset that requires a lot of maintenance. Now, these problems here, I mentioned this experience and these problems. These problems tend to be exacerbated when governments have cash accounting systems. So in a cash accounting system, you don't account for future expected liabilities. You account for what you're paying now. And the neat thing about a PPP for a government that wants to show a better budget in a cash accounting system is all those future liabilities don't show up when they're incurred. They only show up later when payments have to be made. So they can be very attractive for governments with cash accounting systems as a way to hide future liabilities. Now, let me just touch briefly on what you need to do to manage these risks. It's the last slide. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just want to put this up to say the usual prescription is you need strong public investment management systems to manage risks related to PPPs. And there are 5 key phases to a PPP, and you have to get every one right in order to avoid the kind of problems we talk about, or I've talked about. From project selection to project implementation, you have to get all of these right. If I had to highlight a couple of these, contract design, ensuring an efficient allocation of risks and appropriate reward for the private sector is particularly difficult for countries with low capacity. Private sector operators tend to do very well in these negotiations with government and getting risk not transferred to them. That's the whole purpose of a PPP, right? Transfer risk to the private sector. But private negotiators tend to be very good at preventing this. And then, of course, project implementation, ensuring implementation, that also requires quite a lot of oversight from a government, and governments typically don't have the capacity to do this in many developing countries. You usually need to see not only these phases of PPPs, you need to see audit. Government auditing agency has to look at these things, and you need to see parliamentary oversight of the audits. And again, in many countries, many developing countries, those functions, especially audit, aren't terribly well developed. So, to your question, Elizabeth, are these a solution to SDGs? Well, on balance, I think I'd characterize them as a problem to date for developing countries. It's hard to say that something that's been a problem to date can be a solution going forward. And I have to tell you that looking at this last slide, there's a lot of issues to be solved before these could even be a solution. A lot of things have to go right for these kind of projects to make sense for a country, and many developing countries cannot satisfy all those conditions. So I would shy away from saying these are a solution to the financing gap in developing countries. And the message from the fund, when we give this, and this is a distilled version, when we give this presentation, and this is what I've given you is a distilled version of 3-hour workshop that we do for government officials. Our message is caution. Please, caution about these instruments. They can go wrong very easily, and a lot has to go right for them to work. So those are a few thoughts from me, Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much to you, Mark, for this overview, which already includes some very critical tones, I would say, which we might come back to later in a second round. First, I would like to give María José the possibility to give her small input. María José, you were involved in the compilation of examples of what you called failed PPP that Eurodad published last year. Maybe you can give us some insights of this research and where do you see the most severe problems of PPP with regard to debt issues?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conference. I am happy to be here, to see so many people in the room. I am also happy to see that the remarks that Mark from the IMF shared are not so far away from what I have prepared to share with you. So this is going to be an interesting conversation. So in response to your question, Irene, I would say that I have prepared 3 main points in response to that question. The first one is that the choice for PPPs is based on an affordability illusion. And this point also relates to a point that Mark put on the table that has to do with who actually fund PPP projects. And in most cases, the experience shows that the funding comes either from the public budget or from user fees. So PPPs actually do not bring new money, and the illusion is created because of accounting practices that allow governments to keep the cost of PPPs and its contingent liabilities off balance sheet, hidden from national parliament, hidden from the public. Another point that also contributes to the push for PPPs, and it's also related to this affordability illusion, it's the fact that under current austerity measures, governments are not allowed to spend and to increase their spending. So they go for PPPs as a quick win, as a quick fix, but they will have to pay. Someone will have to pay for the cost of that project, and these make PPPs, as I said, based on an affordability illusion. In most of the cases, there is the choice for PPPs is not based on cost-benefit analysis that put on the table all the cost of the project and also the potential risk of the project. And most of the conditions that Mark put on the table to be able to get to a good project are not met. The second point that I want to bring, and is also very much based on the experience of projects in developing countries, but also in developed countries, is that usually PPPs are the most expensive method of financing development projects. And the cost of PPPs comes mainly for 3 main reasons. The first one is the cost of capital. And in most cases, we have seen that this cost can be up to twice the cost of government borrowing. PPPs bring very expensive projects. Secondly, the cost of PPPs come from profit expectations from the private partners. And we have seen that when operating in developing countries, private investors expect a higher profit than when they invest in developed countries due to the perceived risk that these markets have. So we have to take into account that they are expecting a really high profit out of their investment. And in the third place, transaction costs. PPPs come with very high transaction costs at the point of negotiating, implementing, and monitoring projects that are in nature very complex projects. And global accountancy firms have benefited a lot from the PPP business from around the world because of that. So this is the second point, right? PPPs are usually very expensive, a very expensive method of financing projects. And the point number 3 has to do with the focus of this panel, which is hidden debt. And it's because PPPs come with contingent liabilities that can have a substantial impact in countries' fiscal sustainability. In most cases, we have seen that due to the guarantees that countries give to the private companies, they end up in problems, in fiscal problems, because these contingent factors at some point materialize, and they end up paying the risk of this investment. It's important here to take into account that the state is always the residual risk holder. And by this expression, I mean that if something goes wrong, the public sector is the one that it's always responsible. And this means that the public sector has to rescue the company if in the worst scenario, the company failed, the company bankrupt. But in even less problematic scenarios, the state is the one responsible for the services that this company has to deliver. So if a school or if a hospital, a company linked to that school or hospital runs into problems, the state is the one that has to provide the service. And from the research that comes from the IMF, we have seen that these risk of PPPs related to contingent liabilities are very important. I will just mention one that was published last year. Mark might be familiar with the paper that colleagues from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF published in October last year that mentioned a survey of 80 advanced and emerging market economies, showing that the average fiscal cost of PPPs related contingent liabilities that crystallized during the period 1990-2014 was about 1.2% of GDP. And this is an important amount, while the maximum cost was 2% of GDP. So the IMF in many documents understand that PPPs are a very risky business. It was the case in Portugal in 2011, when Portugal was one of the most in-debt countries in the euro area, as a result, among other things, of failed PPP projects. And as a result of that, the IMF, working with the European Central Bank and the European Commission, included in its program with Portugal a special clause demanding the renegotiation of some PPP contracts and a temporary ban on Portugal entering into new PPP arrangements. So definitely it's on the agenda of the IMF that PPPs are a very risky business. From the experience, I would also add that PPPs are an expensive business, and that there are perverse incentives that favor the option of PPPs. Current austerity measures is one of them. The accounting practices, it's the other one. So there is a combination of things that push countries into PPPs. Ideology, as it was mentioned in the introductory remarks, also matters. In most countries, the option of going private comes from an ideology proposition that just assumes that everything that is private is better than delivering through the public sector. So I could add to the cautious approach that Mark put on the table, because it's important to add that there is a lack of empirical evidence in support of the effectiveness of PPPs. And when this evidence is on the table, also points to problems that PPPs face in terms of improving access, generating quality services, promoting decent work, or contributing directly to the reduction of different forms of inequalities. So if we add all the points that we both have mentioned in terms of the fiscal risk of PPPs with the lack of empirical evidence in support for something that is more efficient, I would conclude just saying that definitely PPPs are not a silver bullet, are a very problematic way of financing projects, and it's very problematic that they are being mainstream in the development discourse as the way forward for the SDGs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, María José. Another bunch of some critical aspects. One maybe I would like to, in a way, you, Mark, have also been critical and mentioning that it's not the solution, at least not now, that we need a lot of work to be done. But one point I would like to throw back to you is the question of austerity measures that María José mentioned as one driver, and it's not maybe the least driver for promoting PPP. And there, of course, the IMF has played an important role in asking for these austerity measures, which, of course, would then set the, how María José says, perverse incentive for PPP. And the other aspect maybe is the question of transparency, because in other contexts, you have stated that all countries must meet rules for comprehensive reporting and transparent reporting on public debt. And maybe, as we've seen, there are a lot of hidden liabilities inherent in these PPP. How does that go conform with rules of transparency, say, on government liabilities?
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. First, let me touch on the issue of austerity measures. I would acknowledge, I think countries do try to, quote unquote, solve their fiscal constraint by shifting things off budget. I don't think it's limited to PPPs and investment. When governments face a need to tighten their fiscal policy, these are politically difficult situations, and they look for door number threes, so to speak, ways to solve a problem that involve little pain. The broader, this is not a conference about the broader issue about fiscal adjustment, but I would note that this is an active area of debate about what is a feasible level of fiscal adjustment that a country can undertake when it is developing, when it has social and development investment needs. That's an active area of research, and there are many different views out there on that. I know the private sector tends to take a very hardline view on that countries should pay what they can. I think I would not put the IMF in that category. I think we have and do try to make an assessment of what is feasible in light of development needs, and try not to ask for more adjustment than that. Do we get it right every time? Well, many people have studied that, and I think many people have raised legitimate concerns, and that's fine, that's good, that's healthy to have that debate. So I do think I do think austerity tends to push in this direction. I do think in our programs we could probably do more to resist things being pushed off balance sheet. We've tried to adapt some of our frameworks to make this less attractive to countries. Many of you may be familiar with our low-income country debt sustainability framework, where we've introduced a new contingent liability test that addresses the potential cost of PPPs. And just to add to what Maria said, that test takes 35% of the nominal value of PPPs in the country as our measure of contingent liabilities. 35%. And that's based on our empirical studies. So that gives you an idea of how much governments can miss in terms of the cost. So that's one avenue to try to prevent this. Better analysis that allows us to account for it so that there's no free lunch when people try to push this stuff off budget. That sort of brings me to the transparency question. We do need to expose this. Debt transparency is a big issue right now. I have personally helped oversee preparation of papers for the G20 on this. How do we improve debt transparency? It's a complicated issue. PPPs are sort of one of the most difficult issues in the transparency debate. How do we expose them? And the most difficult version of it is precisely what I mentioned in my presentation, where we have state enterprises doing PPPs. Because typically, right now, we have a lot of difficulty in most developing countries capturing what's happening in state enterprises just at their balance sheet level, let alone their off-balance sheet level. So this is a huge issue. My own sense is that it's going to take several years just to try to bring fiscal reporting up to par in terms of general government plus key state enterprises. Maybe slightly longer to address state enterprises off-balance sheet liabilities because there are complex public investment management and debt management capacity development needs in many of these countries that need to be addressed before these kind of transparency issues can be addressed themselves. So that's a few thoughts from me on those two issues. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, María José, I don't know whether you want to reply particularly on that. On the other hand, I would like to know also what reforms would you think are needed to make PPP, well, move them more towards what could be a solution, and especially to prevent the risk of increased debt. And maybe you take not only the IMF, but also World Bank in count, who is an important player in that issue.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think that is a very relevant one. Having the IMF on the other side and a colleague from the World Bank also in the room. So I could just put as part of my answer quite a lot of different things. And the first one has to do with the role that the IMF plays in its activity with countries. And And it's true, and we do acknowledge the work that the IMF is doing in terms of working on different tools to improve or to support countries in their decision-making process. Also in the reporting of PPP-related debt, the work on debt sustainability framework is welcome, no doubt, and all the different tools. But here it's important to stress the point that I put on the table in my initial remark, that is that the IMF works at the country level with its missions, in their surveillance capacity of countries, when countries have programs with the IMF. Although the issue of fiscal austerity, it's an issue that, as Mark mentioned, it's managed in a cautious way, is without doubt something that pushes indirectly countries into the direction of PPPs, because countries go for off-balance sheet solutions. No matter how hard the IMF has tried with its tools, it's quite clear that the IMF is or has not been able to prevent countries from getting into very risky and expensive PPP contracts. And the IMF has not been able so far to minimize the contingent liabilities of PPPs or the issue of having countries that renegotiate contracts, and in this renegotiation process they are particularly disadvantaged. So clear there is this area that has to be worked out, and this is an area in which the IMF can have a say at different levels. But I do think that the IMF can also have a very big say in its work with the World Bank. And it's the sister institution, it's the institution that is next door. So I would emphasize here that this cautious approach that the IMF is having in terms of the fiscal risk of PPPs, it's something that has not permeated yet the activity of and the discourse of the World Bank and other development finance institutions, because it seems that the whole narrative in development circles is around the promotion of PPPs as something that can solve this financing gap. So I would encourage IMF and World Bank to work more together to arrive to this point in which there is a very strong voice of caution in terms of PPPs, with all these fiscal risks in mind. It's clear that the tools so far have no teeth to actually be able to be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, María José. Now, as you've seen in the program, this is the smallest and the shortest panel, so we're coming to the end. I would like to give you a chance for just one round of questions. If you have a question, please be very brief. We only have a very brief chance for the two panelists afterwards to answer. And I suppose that there's no translation for Mark in Washington, so if the question is directed towards him, I think it must be in English. I'm not sure, but I think it must be in English. So if there's any questions. Oh, even better than, there's one, okay.
Yes. Good afternoon, Laura Van Weeg. I'm coming from Brüssel and working on the financing issue linked to the European financement. And I have a question concerning, following the presentation on PPP, would you say that if the public authorities would have the competency to in financing issues, they will never contract a PPP, if it is the case, because which profit could they have? If it is, the question is, what kind of interest could have the public authorities to contract a PPP right now?
Markus Henn from Wheat. I got a question to Mark. Following up on the question on austerity from Irene. In my understanding, it's not only the fact that austerity is indirectly pushing for PPP, but the IMF is also directly pushing in its conditionalities, or also, for example, in the compact with Africa, for PPPs as a solution. So can you say, how do you explain that? Why is this in these programs and also in the compact with Africa so prominently PPP, if you say, even you think it's not a solution and it's a problematic thing? Can you explain that, please?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, one...
Yes, my name is Eva Hanfstengel from Bread for the World. My concern is the upcoming high-level political forum and dialogue at the United Nations, where all the governments assemble to estimate the financing of the SDGs. And just now, the president of the ECOSOC released a paper and recommends to enabling environment to establish PPPs. So I wonder if the IMF, what can we do to caution this push at the United Nations?
Okay, thank you very much. I stop here. We have 3 questions. I would like to ask you both panelists to put like the answers to the 3 or whatever you feel free to answer together with your final words. So after that, that's sort of the last round for you. Mark, you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Liz. So, as a response to the first question, I think I would say that if countries had proper accounting, proper accrual accounting, and proper auditing, then they would be extremely unlikely to do a PPP. That's how I'd put it. And it's not so much financing competency. I think the real issue, and María mentioned this as well, María José mentioned this as well, the lack of accrual accounting and the lack of proper oversight and auditing are the real issues that facilitate these things. Now, on the UN dialogue, and to some extent on the international dialogue, the compact with Africa, of course, I think, if you step back, what you have is a recognition that there isn't the public funding to provide enough concessional resources for countries to deliver the investment needed to meet the SDGs. So people are searching for answers. If you acknowledge there aren't the public resources available, you are by definition saying that it has to come from the private sector. Now, Compact with Africa, I wouldn't classify as being about PPPs. It's about encouraging private finance. And of course, private finance more generally can come through various channels. One way it can come is through foreign direct investment, right? So there are different ways you can encourage private investment. And I would sort of put our support of things like Compact of Africa in that sort of broader context, an effort to find a way to encourage private finance that is compatible with development and with good public financial management. And I would note that, one of the big differences, for instance, between something like the Compact with Africa and the Belt and Road Initiative is the stress in the Compact with Africa on improving local institutions and the quality of public financial management to set and governance to set conditions favorable to encouraging private financial inflows. Now, the UN. we're happy to make the point on cautioning about PPPs anywhere. I think one of the issues is there is a case for PPPs. If I could summarize it, good PPP projects may create space if efficiency gains are achieved and larger than the very high financial and transaction costs embodied in these projects. So there is a sort of theoretical case, and people find it attractive. Empirically, it's hard to find a lot of cases that live up to the theory. So that's why we're cautious. I think the UN feels obliged to acknowledge the theoretical case. I hope that dialogue, and we will do what we can to introduce into that dialogue the notion that you can't just look at what could be. You have to look at practice and how things actually happen in practice and whether they work. So I would hope that dialogue can move to the practical. Sometimes I find that in talking to the UN, it's important to there's a lot of necessary reference to first best and best possibilities. It's sometimes necessary also to bring the level down, or the discussion down to the level of what's practical and doable and what works. So I hope that dialogue can better capture that going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark, for some open remarks, and let's hope that this indeed is the only intention of the ECOSOC in mentioning this. María José.
I will close, and I will try to answer some of the questions, and I will just focus mainly on the question that Eva raised in relation to the UN, because I really think that Mark put on the table some very open and blunt remarks in terms of the risk. I will not try to be stronger than he was, because he was very clear. So in terms of the UN, I think that on the basis of the remarks that Mark put on the table, I think that it's very important for the whole community of civil society organizations, foundations, activists, parliamentarians from all around the world to showcase and to reveal what is going on with the experience of PPPs on the ground. Because this is the only way to dismantle the theoretical arguments that push for PPPs as the way forward. Because if you contrast the theoretical claims or the claims in favor of PPPs and you contrast them with what is going on in practice, you really see that these efficiency gains do not materialize. And when they do materialize, they come at the cost of people. And workers, citizens, in most cases, are the ones that are impacted by some of these specific projects. So this is in a way a call for action in terms of Eva's question in relation to the UN. And just to conclude, I really want to stress again the role of the World Bank and of the IMF on this agenda. We have met people from the PPP units of African Francophone countries. Most countries in Africa are in desperate need for the right advice and a balanced advice to get into a situation in which they can assess what is the best way for them to finance their projects, with all the alternatives being put on the table. So I would encourage the two institutions to provide this balanced advice that really help countries and citizens to get the services that they are in desperate need, and the fact of not embracing the PPP agenda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope these last words come to the ears that must hear it.